Hi, I'm Dick Stockton. For the past 100 years, Syracuse University's athletes, coaches, and fans have been a part of one of the most enduring traditions in all of sports. The story of Syracuse football is a long and colorful one that has spanned generations and has provided enjoyment to multitudes of its followers. From the dust-filled playing fields of the Pioneers, through Archbold Stadium, where I spent more than a few afternoons, to the Carrier Dome, Syracuse football has always stood for something special.
The first business of a university is the education of the mind. Our primary duty is also the education of the spirit and the education of the body. We want a man to become all that he can become. And there's no question in my mind that the discipline of football and the character building of football, life is one of losses as well as victories. You have to take both.
Well, Nebraska in those days was the only team to beat the Four Horsemen of Notre Dame. They beat them in both 22 and in 23. And in 22 and 23, we were the only team to beat Nebraska. So those were great games. The stadium there at Nebraska in 23 didn't have any grass on it. It was brand new. It was a dust bowl. So and we beat them 7-0. That was one of the outstanding games that I can ever remember.
We had so much wonderful times, many wonderful times, and we had so much camaraderie. We started out living in a freshman football house, 22 of us, and we pretty much stayed together all through our 4 years. And we had reasonably good success on the field, but we had a lot of great times. We didn't have much money, but we sure had fun.
So I used to tell them, and they laugh at me when I was recruiting them. I said, now the toughest course academic course you're going to have at Syracuse is football. And by the time they were sophomores, they'd all come and say, Coach, you were right. We had multiple offense, and we had a lot of multiple learning on blocking. We called our blocking. We jumped our defenses. Things were complex, and especially when you played both ways. So you had a lot of learning.
Well, I obviously have great memories when I was here in the early 50s, and of course, the 1959 team crossed the path of a team that I was coaching at the University of Southern California in 1959, and up until the last 2 weeks of the season, Southern Cal was #1 in the nation, but to the great credit of Syracuse, they prevailed and became the #1 team in the nation. And obviously, I have great emotion for this young team this year. In the 1980s, they've demonstrated that Syracuse and the greatness of Syracuse can well be in its future, and we're all kind of proud.
To start our season off to be a very successful season, and I bid to the Sugar Bowl as a result. Then the comparing became, the styles, the running styles, the strength, the power as compared to the elusiveness, and tried to compare the 3 or 4 44s. And that's when it became something that the press began to write about. I think Look, the magazine Look did a feature. Life did a great feature featuring the 3 of us that I still have. And that was one of the better articles that I had been involved in at an early age. And then you start to look at what these guys had accomplished, and to be named or your name mentioned with theirs, it was quite an honor, really quite an honor, one that I have cherished for, I guess, 24 to 25 years.
Well, Ernie was a man of all seasons. He was a great human being, a great all-around athlete, a very bright young man, the kind of individual who could get along with anyone yet be his own man. I had a tremendous amount of respect for him, and almost had the opportunity to play with him as the Cleveland Browns. Unfortunately, I didn't get that opportunity.
Perhaps the most outstanding game was the game in which Phil Allen played and starred and won the ball game for us. You've probably made mention of it, you've heard about it, when Syracuse trailed Cornell in the closing moments of a ball game, and Vinny Eichler, the Cornell fullback, broke through, was running up near midfield, and he heard a voice shouting, "Lateral, give it to me, give it to me." And he did, gave it to Phil Allen of Syracuse. And Phil was downed almost immediately, and then Will Sidat saying, threw Phil a pass, a down-and-out pass, which Phil caught for the winning touchdown in the closing seconds of play, and we upset Cornell 19-17. It was a big one. It was a real big one.
The two things that stand out, I suppose, in my mind, as in most people's minds, would be the win over Nebraska several years ago, a total surprise to the entire country. That was an exciting time. And the other one is the West Virginia game at the end of the '87 series, when the football program went undefeated in the regular season. I think those are the two things that stand out most clearly in my mind.
I think there are a lot of people that were responsible for this happening. I think the key, quite honestly, to our success would be the Cherry Bowl of 1985. If we had to single out one person that made this all possible from a football player standpoint, it would be Tim Green in our era. I think if you identified Ben's era, it would be Jimmy Brown, but I don't want to speak for Ben. There are a lot of great players in between, but now the charismatic Donnie McPherson led everybody to believe here's what everybody wants in a student athlete. You know, great charisma, a lot of fun playing the game. And then the other side of the coin, you get Ted Gregory, the mean old nasty guy that was down in the dirt. So I think we had all the characteristics of elevating our program. I think the next year coming back in the Hall of Fame Bowl game, winning that LSU game, gave us tremendous credibility. And now as we approach our centennial year, wow, the pressure is real on because we can't stay where we're at.
Coach Dick McPherson and his players have a true sense of the tradition that is Syracuse football. Pep talks by Coach Ben and the photos of All-Americans that line the walls at Manley Fieldhouse are constant reminders of past greatness. The story of Syracuse football is a long and colorful one that has spanned the century and has provided enjoyment to generations of Americans. Let's take a look at how it all began and prospered and gave this country some of its greatest sports legends.
Every fall, when the smell of dried leaves and early morning frost fills the air, backyard sandlots, playing fields, and quiet streets are transformed with sounds of excited voices, scuffling feet, and the contact of youth playing America's most beloved game. Perhaps nowhere else is the spirit of this magical sport as alive as on the college campuses around the country, such as Syracuse, where on an autumn afternoon, tens of thousands of the Orange faithful have been making the pilgrimage to the center of campus to see their heroes engage in a game which Syracuse alumnus Stephen Crane once compared to the rage of conflict on a battlefield. Of course, football wasn't always a metaphor for war. In a quieter time, Syracuse University students prepared themselves for their first intercollegiate contest with the University of Rochester by working out in a tiny park with fence rails serving as sideline markers. Student John Blake Hillier was the founder and first captain of the first Syracuse squad in 1889, and while the final score from the Rochester contest was less than encouraging, the seeds planted by Hillier and Sam Jacobson, an ex-Yale player who served as trainer, were sown. 1890 saw the arrival of the team's first coach, a tough little Englishman by the name of Bobby Winston, who reveled in drilling his team with 3-mile runs over the fields toward Onondaga Valley and tough workouts. The preparation paid off. Syracuse went 8-3, including the school's first intercollegiate victory, 4-0 over Rochester. Football in those days was characterized by its detractors as little more than rough, hard play and indiscriminate slugging. Due to derisive comments from the spectators, Syracuse's uniforms and school colors were changed from pink and blue to orange. Although a room had been appropriated for use by the team in the Hall of Languages, the dressing room was little more than a space in the basement with a trap door leading to an icy cistern for the players to wash in. The field wasn't much better, with players raking the melon-sized rocks off before game time. In 1895, Syracuse got its first home field. The Oval occupied the area where the quad is today. There were some physically imposing players of that era, most notably the famed Ned Glass and Frank Craig. It should be noted that most of the early football enthusiasts were considerably lighter than their modern counterparts today. But in spite of their modest weights, these were tough, hardened athletes. Players like Lynn Wyckoff, Martin Smallwood, Charles Byrne, Carl Dorr, and Hayden Old Boss Patton, Charles Marvin, and, in this rare photo, future Orange coach George Bond were tough as nails. They had to be. The uniform of the time offered little in the way of protection, and participants had to expect the unexpected. Against Colgate in 1897, Patton was running for what would have been Syracuse's winning touchdown when he was tackled by a local newspaperman partial to Colgate. Coaches Frank Wade and Edwin Sweetland successfully carried Syracuse football into the next century. Although the Cornell game of 1900 degenerated into a bloody slugfest, with one of the Big Red's finest nearly being drowned on the flooded, muddy field as someone held his head down. Cornell didn't play Syracuse again for 30 years. This rough, tough style of football was being practiced throughout the country, much to the delight of students, alumni, and the public. In 1905, President Roosevelt called together representatives from the major colleges and universities to help put a stop to the violence and mayhem. Despite increased scrutiny, the game was as wild and popular as ever. 1906 witnessed the arrival of energetic Frank "Buck" O'Neill to coach the Orange. A brilliant innovator who would later be elected to the College Hall of Fame, O'Neill was known not only as the father of the off-tackle play, but also was one of the first to employ the forward pass. That year, John D. Archbold, a university trustee, made the university a gift of the greatest athletic arena in America. A magnificent concrete stadium that would hold upwards of 35,000 spectators and signal a new era in Syracuse football. Archbold Stadium opened on September 25th, 1907, with a victory against Hobart. The first game in Archbold featured a 75-yard touchdown by Syracuse's first All-American, a 6-foot 2-inch, 240-pound tackle named Marquis Bill Orr, who was known to playfully grab his smaller teammates and elevate them above his head. A gentle giant off the field, he was all business at game time. Bill and his teammates in 1908 soundly defeated Michigan, held Princeton to a scoreless tie, and while losing to Yale 5-0, did not allow the Elis a first down in the game. The Jones brothers would coach after O'Neill's departure, garnering respectable but not sensational reviews. Most notable in the victory column was Syracuse's win over the legendary Jim Thorpe and his Carlisle Indian team. O'Neill returned to campus in 1913 and with Captain Marty Hilfinger and Jackie Rudy Probst made the best of a thin bench as the Orange went 6-4. In this rare footage, you can see Chancellor Day, a champion of the new sport, sitting in the stands on the left of the screen, cheering players coming out on the field. The scientific sport of football, a student of which we see demonstrating the correct kicking technique, was still the darling of the public in the years just before the war. Players were heroes, no more so than those on O'Neill's 1915 edition, regarded as one of the greatest all-time Syracuse teams. The team featured the famous Big Four of T.R. Johnson, Babe White, Walter Camp All-America Chris Schlachter, and Ty Cobb. Together, they weighed in at nearly half a ton. Quarterbacked by Chick Meehan and halfbacks Walt Rose and Red Wilkinson, Syracuse went 9-1-2 that year. Incredibly, there were 7 shutouts, 1 scoreless tie, 331 points scored, and 16 allowed, including victories over Michigan, Oregon State, Montana, and Colgate. With the winds of war blowing in Europe, O'Neill continued to field respectable teams. The highlight of 1917's 8-1-1 winning season was the 10-9 defeat of Nebraska and victories over Michigan State and Rutgers. With the university and students doing their part for the war effort, the star tackle, Louis Usher, and his fellow Orange Gritters shortened their season. In 1919, O'Neill fielded another brilliant club. Led by Joe Alexander, a two-time All-America tackle and Hall of Famer, the Orangemen went 8-3 and were Grantland Rice's pick as the nation's top club that year. Behind the brute strength of Alexander and the hands of Joe Schwartzer, the Orange buried 24-3 a Pop Warner-led Pittsburgh team that hadn't lost in 4 years. Syracuse would begin the next decade with a new coach. Frank O'Neill would be gone, but the legacy he and his players left the university would remain. Syracuse University had established itself as a power to be reckoned with on the national scene.
The colorful 20s brought much in the way of change to Syracuse University. Charles Wesley Flint replaced Day as chancellor, and flamboyant showman, tactician, and psychologist John Chick Meehan took the reins of the Orange. Meehan, a former Orange quarterback, had a penchant for getting his players up for the big ones. His accomplishments included back-to-back victories in 22 and 23 over one of the greatest Nebraska teams of all time, a club that had dominated mighty four-horsemen-led Notre Dame. Meehan got his players ready for the Cornhuskers by telling them that the only reason they wanted to play Syracuse was to visit Niagara Falls after knocking them off. It so infuriated the Syracuse players that they did the knocking off in a brutally fought 9-6 contest. Under Meehan's guidance from 20 to 24, the Orange never lost more than 2 games per season. Much of the success could be attributed to the superbly conditioned football players he produced, including star runner and passer Jack McBride, stellar tackle and famed coach Lynn Pappy Waldorf, Doc Joe Alexander, Pete McRae, Reeves Ribs Basinger, Olympian Chet Bowman, Gifford Zimmerman, and of course Syracuse legend Roy Simmons. A gifted athlete, Simmons quarterbacked the Orange from 1922 through 24 and was captain of both the football and the lacrosse teams. In 1923, Syracuse went 8-1 with victories over Alabama, Pittsburgh, Penn State, and Nebraska. Syracuse was invited to play in the Rose Bowl, an invitation which was declined by Chancellor Flint, to the rage and disappointment of the players. In 1925, Pete Reynolds took over the reins of the Orange, with Simmons assisting. Graduation had depleted the ranks somewhat, but Reynolds could find consolation in the form of a solid core of performers, including the incomparable Vic Hansen. Hansen, a Syracuse native, was a tremendous all-round athlete. Blessed with the speed and a sensational pair of hands, the All-America could catch everything thrown in his direction. To this day, Vic Hansen remains the only Syracuse athlete ever to be inducted into both the National Football Foundation and Basketball Hall of Fame. Behind the speed of Hansen and Gotch Carr, the finesse of future Olympian Ray Barbuti and Charles Arkoska, and the talents of Bus Friedman, Charlie Lee, and Harv Levy, the Orange went 8-1 with victories over Penn State, Indiana, and Columbia. The following year, another fine team was fielded. Unfortunately, the season was marred by a meeting with West Point, which resulted in one of the bloodiest confrontations ever staged in the name of college football. Following the Massacre of the Plains, as it was called, Syracuse and Army would not meet again for nearly 30 years. Toward the end of the decade, Lou Andreas, who was later to become longtime athletic director at Syracuse, took over the coaching reins. Andreas' teams, if not world beaters, were respectable and well coached. Stars of his teams were Harold Basinger, Ray Barbuti, Jonah Goldman, and Warren Stevens. The first night game in the East was played in 1929 versus Hobart with a white football. In 1930, Syracuse University's greatest all-around athlete was named head coach. At 27, Vic Hansen was one of the youngest coaches in the nation. In 1932, Hansen's team went 7-1-1, including victories over Florida, Penn State, Ohio Wesleyan, and sleepy Jim Crowley's powerful Michigan State Spartans. Stars during the Hansen era included the All-American tackle Jim Steen, Joe Vavra, Art Kramer, Ed Jantos, the Singer twins, George Perrault, and running back Vanny Albanese, who during the Michigan State victory carried the ball 17 consecutive times. Throughout the 30s, school spirit and interest in football were never higher. There were elaborate homecoming parades with floats, bands, and dances, and the Saltine Warrior replaced Billy the Goat as mascot. Football weekends were the most exciting of events on campus. On game day, co-eds sat on opposite sides of the field from the men, and all the kids in the neighborhood would try their best to squeeze through the fence at Archbold to get a glimpse of their heroes. Unfortunately for Coach Hansen, Syracuse's competition with their nearby neighbor in Hamilton was assuming mythic proportions. The last time the Orangemen had defeated the Red Raiders was in 1925, and pressure was building on the young coach to produce a victory. Students, faculty, and alumni had rallies, bonfires, anything to help crash the Colgate jinx, or the hoodoo. It was to no avail, however, and eventually Vic stepped down. In 1937, Ossie Solem was named head coach of the Orange. With Clarence Biggie Munn and Bud Wilkinson at his side, Solem declared, "I'm no miracle man. We'll do what we can with what we have and hope for the best." Solem's first season, the Orange went 5-2-1, respectable by any standard. But it was the 1938 season that would be forever remembered in the hearts and the minds of the Orange faithful. The 38 team had some brilliant talent. Phil Allen, Red Heater, Harold Babe Ruth, the irrepressible Duffy Dougherty, Dick Banger, and a superb passer, Wilmuth Siddhat Singh. I also played on that team. The first of the miracle contests is still referred to as the game. Syracuse versus Cornell before a crowd of 25,000 in Archbold Stadium. The Big Red leads 10-0 going into the final quarter. Within a period of 6 minutes, Syracuse, behind the powerful arm of Siddhat Singh, scored 3 lightning touchdowns and pulled out a 19-17 victory in what many, including the legendary sports writer Grantland Rice, considered to be one of the most dramatic contests in college football history. Siddhat Singh was one of the finest players of his era. Despite racial prejudice from some of Syracuse's opponents, Siddhat Singh rose above the humiliation, impressing his teammates with his character, coolness under pressure, and his brilliance. If SU Cornell was the game, then SU Colgate 38 and its effects on the city and populace of Syracuse must have been a northern Mardi Gras. After 14 long, embarrassing years, a Siddhat Singh-led Syracuse team defeated Colgate 7-0. A long punt return by Dick Banger and a 14-yard touchdown end around by the multi-talented Phil Allen won the ball game. The breaking of the jinx resulted in sheer pandemonium. A year later, Syracuse again defeated the Red Raiders, forever laying to rest the hated hoodoo. Ossie Solem and his players had found their niche in SU folklore. Solem's innovative coaching and revolutionary play development, like the reverse center, were crowd pleasers. The reverse center play consisted of having the center face his own backfield and resulted in the baffling of Orange opponents until it was outlawed in 1941. For over a quarter of a century, Solem, Reynolds, Meehan, and their peers had helped extend Syracuse's winning tradition. For all their successes, however, they would have been hard-pressed to envision the giddy heights that Syracuse football would ascend to in future years.
After the departure of Ossie Solem, Clarence Biggie Munn and later Reeves Basinger tried their hand at coaching the Orange with mixed results. Certainly, there were some brilliant individual talents, like running backs Walter Sliver Slavinsky, Horace Morris, and Joe Watt, but not in the quantity that other schools had. Syracuse football was in another transition, awaiting the right leader to turn it around. It found such an individual in one Floyd Ben Schwarzwalder. Schwarzwalder, a West Virginia graduate and ex-paratrooper, had enjoyed success in his previous positions at smaller schools and hoped to build Syracuse into a consistent winner. In 1953, he took a Syracuse team that barely had more than the necessary platoon of players to face Alabama in the Orange Bowl. While the Orange lost the contest, the year was a resounding success with a 7-2 record and the first bowl appearance in the school's history. Hard work and determination were beginning to pay off. The foundation laid earlier by Bernie Custis, a superb passer and talented athlete, quarterback Pat Stark, Jim Ringo, George Davis, Bob Young, Aveda Stone, Bob Fleck, and sure-handed Joe Zombathy was set. Flushed with success and deserved national publicity, additional funds were allocated for the program and eventually more scholarships. In 1953, Syracuse recruited a youngster from Long Island by the name of Jim Brown. He was given a jersey with the number 44. It would be the beginning of the closest thing that approaches legend in Syracuse football folklore, a magical number worn by a succession of unbelievably talented athletes. With the unstoppable Brown and other gifted athletes like Jim Ridlin, Syracuse would field competitive teams through 1956. During that period, Brown would develop into the premier running back in the country at the tender age of 20. Jim Brown was indisputably the finest college player in the country in 1956, and many players on the opposing teams had the lumps to prove it. Hall of Famer and West Virginia linebacker Sam Huff remembers his first meeting with Big Jim at Morgantown. I looked down the field and saw the biggest running back I'd ever seen. Huge shoulders and arms, no hips, and huge legs. The perfectly built human being. During the course of the game, which the Orange won, Sam got his first big shot at Jim. When he regained consciousness, he discovered that he had been hit so hard that his nose was broken and several of his teeth were missing. So much for first impressions. Behind the power and speed of Jim Brown's ball carrying, the hands of Jim Ridlon, and the arm of Chuck Zimmerman, the Orange compiled a credible 7-1 record. Brown's 43-point Archibald farewell performance against Colgate still stands 33 years later in the NCAA record books as the most remarkable individual scoring performance of all time. National attention turned to the Orange in the postseason with a Cotton Bowl meeting with TCU. The game turned out to be a classic, as the Orangemen were barely edged 28-27 on a block kick. Syracuse, however, even in defeat, had jumped several notches in prestige in the nation's eyes. If 1957 was a respectable year for the Orange, 1958 was outstanding. Behind quarterback Chuck Zimmerman, halfback Gerhard Schwades, and tackle Ron Luciano, the Orange went 8-1, the best record since 1939. Victories over Nebraska, Penn State, Pittsburgh, and West Virginia were satisfying ones for Ben. Although the Orange bowed to a powerful Oklahoma team in the Orange Bowl 21-6, they had no regrets. The stage had been set for the ultimate season. Before the start of the 1959 season, Syracuse coaches had indications they had the makings of a pretty good football team. The first and second teams were loaded with speed and talent. They had a young sophomore from Elmira named Ernie Davis. Ernie had come to Syracuse to follow in the footsteps of his idol Jim Brown. Wearing the same number as Brown, Magic 44, Davis soon left little doubt that he was a worthy successor to Brown. Breaking a series of school records, Davis would leave Syracuse with an incredible 6.6 yards per carry average that still stands in the record books. Ernie's speed, power, and elusiveness combined with a backfield of Dave Surrett at quarterback and Ger Schwades at the other halfback position was the kind of combination that coaches dream of. Beside an arsenal of outstanding offensive firepower, the 1959 team would post an incredible 5 shutouts, holding many teams to minus rushing figures. Tenacious line play was responsible for much of Syracuse's success. And the brawny, sizable 7, consisting of All-America Roger Davis, Fred Martino, Al B. Miller, Bob Yates, Bruce Tarbox, Maury Yeomans, and Jerry Skonecki, struck fear into the heart of many an opposing team. A John Hato-led Kansas team was defeated, and Maryland, Navy, Holy Cross, and West Virginia were all blown away by huge margins. With national attention focusing on the Orange following the 44-0 demolition of the West Virginia Mountaineers, Ben remarked in his understated manner, "We just take them one game at a time. Heck, we're just country folks." Following the 35-0 destruction of Pittsburgh, the Orange went through the rest of the schedule like a knife through warm butter. It should be noted that Ben had the luxury of using two almost equally talented units. Brilliant quality players, the likes of fullback Art Baker, bone-crushing linemen John Brown and Gene Grabowski, an assorted supporting cast that one writer likened to a group of marauding monsters of the Midway. Syracuse faced Texas in the Cotton Bowl in a game that would decide the national championship. On the second play of the game, Davis reeled in a perfect Gare Schwade's pass and raced 87 yards for a touchdown, stunning the Longhorns. Despite a pulled hamstring, Davis would score again and be voted the game's most valuable player. With an undercurrent of racial tensions directed at some of Syracuse's players, emotions ran high in this violent, warlike matchup. In the end, the Orange prevailed 23-14 and laid sole claim to the title of nation's best. The following year, Syracuse would go a respectable 7-2, but reject the bowl appearance. Ben continued to attract talented players like tight end John Mackey, one of the most skilled and powerful players ever to hold that position at SU, and to end Walt Sweeney. 1961 was notable not only because Syracuse defeated Miami in the Liberty Bowl 15-14 behind the fabulous running of Davis and passing of Surratt, or because Ernie Davis was awarded the Heisman Trophy as the best football player in the land, the first black ever to be awarded such an honor, but because of a controversial game versus the Fighting Irish of Notre Dame, as Orangeman Walt Sweeney was called for roughing the Notre Dame kicker. Time ran out in the game. Instead of the Orange walking away with a 15-14 decision, an overzealous umpire incorrectly allowed the Irish to attempt a closer field goal. With no time showing on the clock, the kick sailed through the uprights and South Bend went wild. The game soon became the talk of the nation, and the controversy even reached the White House.
Some Republicans have been unkind enough to suggest that my election, which was somewhat close, was somewhat similar to the Notre Dame-Syracuse game. But I'm like Notre Dame. We get as it comes, and we're not giving it back.
It was not until the return match in 1963 that Ben was able to return the Irish hospitality by subduing the Midwesterners 14-7. That year, Syracuse went 8-2 behind such talents as John Mackey, Charlie Brown, and a pile-driving running back named Jim Nance. At 6'1", 225 pounds, Nance, who would later become an NCAA heavyweight champion wrestler, terrorized defenses and became known as one of the most powerful fullbacks ever to play that position. In 1964, he was paired with a new running back from New Haven named Floyd Little, who had inherited the legendary number 44 from Ernie Davis. The duo was the stuff football dreams are made of. In 1964, Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside, as they would come to be known, gained over a mile on the gridiron, eclipsing storied Davis and Blanchard, the tandem of Army. Floyd Little's first game against Kansas in Archbold was an amazing 254-yard, 5-touchdown effort. Before his career was over at Syracuse, Little would account for nearly 5,000 yards of offense. That season, with victories over Penn State, Pittsburgh, and a 39-0 blowout of UCLA, Little ran wild. With virtually every defense in the country geared to stopping the Syracuse running attack, the elusive Little and powerful Nance made a shambles of their opponents' game plans. Syracuse faced LSU in the Sugar Bowl at season's end, and in spite of going down a grudging 7-3, Ben's club did nothing to diminish the much-deserved reputation of Eastern football. With Nance graduating, almost miraculously, his position was filled by a young Ohio farm boy named Larry Zonka. The muscular Zonka, who was 6'3", and by his senior year weighed in at a bone-crushing 238, was almost immediately the quality complement to Little's open field running that Nance had been. The chemistry between Zonka, guard Gary Bugenhagen, and Pat Kaloran's devastating blocking was perfect. Little was practically into the secondary on every other play. In 1966, Syracuse, a notoriously slow-starting club, went 8-2, defeating the likes of Maryland, BC, Pitt, Penn State, Florida State, and West Virginia. Larry Zonka's punishing straight-ahead power running made him one of the most feared and hardest to bring down players on the gridiron. With strong-armed Rich Casada at the controls, Syracuse took on the Tennessee Volunteers in the Gator Bowl. After spotting the Volunteers an almost insurmountable lead, Little and Zonka went to work, pounding around and through the line and punishing the secondary. Tennessee was barely able to withstand the furious comeback attempt. Between Zonka's power running and Little's 216 yards, which is more than Tennessee gave up to an entire team that season, they almost pulled it off. Floyd said that if the game was just a few minutes longer, the sun might have set orange that night. Be that as it may, Little, Zonka, Art Toms, Bugenhagen, Chayunsky, Kayaski and company had given a magnificent accounting of themselves, and even in defeat, stood tall in the eyes of a national TV audience that had marveled at their never-say-die attitude. With three-time All-America Floyd Little's departure, Larry Zonka was confronted with a challenge to keep the ground game moving. Zonk responded with a driving style that gave pause to even the most ardent linemen and defensive backs. Tackling the nearly 240-pound fullback was compared to grabbing a 220-volt power line with your teeth. It was not uncommon to see Zonka dragging 2, 3, and 4 defensive players down the field. In 1967, the Casada-led underrated Orangemen went 8-2 and climaxed their season by traveling to Los Angeles to abuse Heisman Trophy winner Gary Beeben's UCLA Bruins 32-14. Casada and Zonka departed, and in 1968, the Orange went 6-4 with leaders Tony Gabriel and Al Newton.
In '69, the Orange barely went 500. But in 1970, the program had problems of another nature, when black players who boycotted practice were asked to leave the team. Eventually, all the players were reinstated, and administrative reforms made in the program.
It was a trying season for all involved. Miraculously, the Orange managed to subdue a powerful Penn State team 24-7 and demolish Miami 56-16. From 71 to 74, the Orange had a hard time breaking 500. To be sure, there was some brilliant individual talent. The likes of Tommy Myers, Joe Ehrman, Stan Walters, Dan Yoakum, Greg Allen, and Marty Januszkiewicz. But again, they never had the quantity of athletes that their key opponents had. In 1973, Ben Schwarzwalder would retire from coaching his beloved Orangemen. He accomplished what a golden few in his profession aspire to. His record of 22 straight winning seasons, 4 Lambert trophies, 7 bowl games, 153 victories, and a national championship made him one of the winningest college coaches of all time and put him securely on a level with the great tacticians and teachers of the game. In 1982, he would be inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame to join the Rockneys, O'Neills, and Warners. He had molded Syracuse into a national power. Now it was time for others to carry on with the tradition.
Hi, I'm Marv Albert. With Ben Schwarzwalder's departure, Syracuse went to the Big Ten Conference and found an energetic 33-year-old defensive coach from the University of Michigan to become the 24th head coach of the Orange. Frank Maloney inherited a program that was in the doldrums. In the mid-'70s, Syracuse teams would attempt to compensate for their lack of depth with hard play and enthusiasm. It was an uphill struggle, however, yet there were some fine moments in the Maloney years. In '75, Ray Preston, Keith Moody, Ken Clark, Dave Jacobs, and Jim Donahue and company tripped Bobby Bowden's Peach Bowl-bound West Virginia Mountaineers in a nail-biter. And even football powerhouses like Ohio State, Miami, and Michigan State knew that they were in a fight when the Orange rolled into town. When the final gun sounded in 1978, at the conclusion of the Syracuse-Navy game, the demolition of the venerable Archbold Stadium was begun. At 71, it had outlived its usefulness. A magnificent 50,000-seat dome stadium would be erected at the site of Archbold. It would be completed in time for the 1980 season and be the only on-campus facility of its kind. Like its aged predecessor, it would have a profound effect on the Syracuse football program. In 1979, Syracuse football took to the road while the Carrier Dome was being constructed. It was to be Frank Maloney's most successful season as a coach. With a talented and fearless quarterback named Bill Hurley, the Orange would go 7-5 that year, which included a win over McNeese State in the Independence Bowl. Complemented by a solid offensive line that included Craig Wolfley and a defense keyed by linebacker Jim Collins, Hurley worked the option to perfection, and his accurate passing often found the incomparable Art Monk running wide open. Gary Anderson handled the kicking, and the backfield belonged to one Joe Morris. With incredible speed and power, the 5'7", 180-pound running back would rewrite Orange record books. It mattered little who Syracuse's opponents were. Joe would find an opening in opposing lines and be gone. Before he would leave Syracuse, Joe Morris would account for an incredible 4,299 yards rushing, eclipsing the marks set by all-time greats Zonka, Little, Davis, and Brown. In 1980, at the Carrier Dome opening, the Orange would post a 36-24 victory over Miami of Ohio in a steamy night opener. That year, the Orange would go 5 up and 6 down. It would be Frank Maloney's last season at Syracuse. As the warm days of August gave way to the chill of fall, changes in the Syracuse football program were in the air. Dick McPherson, a native of Maine and assistant coach with the Cleveland Browns, was brought in by Jake Krauthamel, the SU athletic director, to assume head coaching duties. In McPherson's first year behind the spectacular running of Joe Morris, Syracuse managed to post a 4-6-1 record. The highlights of the season saw SU defeat a Doug Flutie-led Boston College club and score a 27-24 upset of Peach Bowl-bound West Virginia. In 1982, a Mike Charles and Tony Romano-led Syracuse team started out the season with a victory over Rutgers in the Meadowlands. Although there were some hints of promise, the best the Orange could do would be to post a 2-9 record. Dick McPherson's only consolation in that rebuilding year was that he had brought in an outstanding freshman class. McPherson firmly believed that to field the kind of team needed to compete, he had to land the state's finest players. He did just that when Tim Green, a local high school star and Parade All-America, signed a letter of intent to play for the Orange. Symbolically, McPherson's signing of one of the most highly recruited high school players in all the nation was a coup. Besides depriving the competition, including arch-rival Joe Paterno's Nittany Lions, of an outstanding player, Green's commitment attracted other outstanding players. The 1983 season proved that the labors of Coach McPherson and his staff were beginning to bear fruit. With one of the toughest schedules in the nation, the Orange posted victories over Boston College, over a strong West Virginia club. They shut down a Napoleon McCallum-led Navy team and very nearly upset powerful Penn State. Syracuse also posted its 500th win in a victory over Rutgers. A marked improvement in the Orange defense was one of the reasons for the Syracuse success. SU assistant coach George O'Leary's linemen made up a defensive unit called Four-Wheel Drive, comprised of tackles Blaze Winter and Tim Green, nose guard Bill Pendock, and outside linebacker Jamie Kimmel. The group frequently harassed, tormented, and abused opposing quarterbacks to distraction with their aggressive, hard-nosed play. With the linebackers and secondary starting to come into their own, McPherson was able to concentrate on the offense. In 1984, quarterback Todd Norley and teammates engineered the upset of the #1 rated Nebraska Cornhuskers to post one of the biggest victories in Syracuse football history. With the defense led by Tim Green, Jamie Kimmel, and Rudy Reed harassing Nebraska, the offense passed and pounded on the visitors, securing the 17-9 victory. Needless to say, the fans loved it. Additional victories over Maryland, Pittsburgh, Northwestern, and Army allowed Syracuse to forge the first back-to-back winning seasons since the late 60s. The 1985 season marked the emergence of another player who was to have a major impact on Syracuse football. Don McPherson was the ECAC Rookie of the Year before he was injured in 1984. In 1985, a healthy McPherson passed for nearly 1,500 yards and 12 touchdowns, often to superb targets like Scott Schwades and Mike Ciano. With a solid offensive line, running back Robert Drummond, and a veteran defensive unit, the Orangemen were not a group to be taken lightly. In '85, the Orange posted a 7-4 record, which included an exciting near win over arch-rival Penn State. The offense was exciting and competitive. The defense, anchored by Green, was ranked 4th nationally against the run. Green, who was often double-teamed, finished his career with an incredible 45.5 sacks. With Chancellor Eggers and Coach McPherson in attendance, co-captains Reed and Green accepted the official bid to play Maryland in the Cherry Bowl. Although Maryland would prevail in the contest, Coach McPherson and his staff would use the program's resurgence to make 1985 one of the most successful recruiting efforts in Syracuse history. In '86, the Orange went 5-6. One of McPherson's favorite receivers, Scott Schwades, was catching everything thrown in his direction. and in the process, rewriting the record books. 1987 proved a banner year for SU athletics. The basketball team made it down to New Orleans for the NCAA's Final Four, and the Syracuse football team, led by Don McPherson, Rob Drummond, nose guard Ted Gregory, and Tommy Kane, made a return trip 9 months later to the Sugar Bowl. 1987 was the year that Syracuse electrified the college sports world by going a perfect 11-0 for the regular season. The merciless pounding being administered to arch-rival Penn State in the Carrier Dome before a national TV audience by Donnie McPherson, Rob Moore, Pat Kelly, Ted Gregory, Rob Drummond, Tommy Kane and company personifies the kind of hard-nosed, in-your-face football that Ben Schwarzwalder loves so much. The fans went wild. For the first time in 17 years, Penn State was defeated by a score of 48-21 as McPherson passed for a record 336 yards. Victories over Maryland, Rutgers, Miami, Virginia Tech, Missouri, Colgate, Pittsburgh, Navy, Boston College, and an incredible final game of the year photo finish with West Virginia, furnished courtesy of Michael Owens, capped the season. Syracuse faced mighty SEC champion Auburn in the Sugar Bowl before 75,000. Although the Orangemen outplayed the Tigers and Donnie McPherson was named the MVP of the game, at the contest's end, the score read 16-16. Auburn's coach, Pat Dye, went for the tie instead of the win. No matter, Syracuse had proven itself as the first squad to go undefeated since 1959. The first team to finish the top 10 since 1960, and the first Lambert Trophy winner since the days of Floyd Little. Coach Dick McPherson had done something that only rarely had been accomplished in the history of Syracuse football. He had molded an undefeated season. Of course, while one could never quite duplicate the thrill of 1987, the 1988 edition came excitingly close. Behind the highly accurate passing of previously unheralded quarterback Todd Philcox, the Orange posted a 10-2 record, defeating for a second time Penn State's Nittany Lions. Behind the power running and blocking of Darrell Johnston, Robert Drummond, and the heir apparent to the 44 legacy, Michael Owens, Syracuse pounded away at the opposition. A fleet-footed group of receivers, a tough defensive line supported by swift linebackers and arguably the best secondary in the country, led by All-America Marcus Paul, spelled success for the Orange. Extended an invitation to the Hall of Fame Bowl to meet SEC co-champion Louisiana State, the Orangemen stood tall. While everyone wondered how the boys from Syracuse would stand up to the heat and the powerful Tiger attack, the Orange, before a national TV audience, promptly went about the business of completely outplaying the Tigers. Syracuse's superb conditioning paid off, as it had all season, as the LSU players were the ones who wilted. It proved to be a great victory over a quality program. That Syracuse football has again risen to national prominence is a tribute to Dick McPherson and his staff, and to the university's administration. But it is also a testimony to the tough, strong young men who have played for the Orange and built a tradition. In the true college spirit, these athletes have brought the finest measure of their talents and energy to the game that they love. Syracuse University has engaged in football competition at the highest level for a century. Its history is intertwined with that of other pioneering universities and their collegiate legends, the Thorpes, Rotneys, Warners, and such. Syracuse, too, has fielded legendary teams, and athletes like the late Ernie Davis personified all that is good and right in collegiate athletic competition. These young men have provided dreams, enjoyment, and satisfaction to generations of Americans. In a day and age when today's fascination is tomorrow's forgotten symbol, Syracuse football and its legends have endured. And for the youngsters who dream of greatness on leaf-filled autumn afternoons, it has provided an inspiration to be part of a tradition and follow in footsteps that were traveled so long ago.